All right, y'all, let's get into this. Like I mentioned at the start of class, I wanted to kind of give us a practical introduction into using Git and GitHub and working with React a little bit more specifically. So part of what we've been talking about is one, getting set up with React and like how to like create different applications using like the React tool chains. But now, that we kind of have talked about that a little bit, I think it's important to get some time to figure out how we're going to kind of work on that flow of using Create React app and also like working on projects more specifically into the future. So point of today's class is to talk about the functionality of like Git and like how it kind of connects to GitHub, which is why I'm here sharing the GitHub page. But then we'll work on another React app and kind of connect it to GitHub, make some changes locally, talk about what that means, and explore how we would be using Git in a more professional kind of context as we were working on these projects. And so using Git is like one of those skills that you need to learn as you start working on more professional level projects. It is really helpful for both your own personal use, but also like also using it in professional context as well. Like if you're working with a team or you're working with like if you're working on like kind of a larger scale project, you can you would normally use Git to collaborate with your team and the people in that capacity. So we'll talk about that a little bit more and in detail in a bit, but also we'll get a lot more practical information on that as we kind of get deeper into the content and start working on some more robust applications and stuff. So cool. Thank y'all for being here and rocking with me, and hopefully you find this content helpful. So dope. So I'm on the GitHub page, and so github.com is a website that allows for you as an engineer to host your code online. And so essentially what GitHub hosts are called repositories. These repositories you could think of as like different like source code and project files that you can organize and save to the cloud that's hosted on GitHub. So GitHub itself is just a tool for like to host the files that you're interested in saving and using. But there's an underlying tool that GitHub is making use of that is important to understand as a separate entity to like GitHub, and that's Git. So when people start talking about Git, they're talking about that underlying tool, that framework of sorts that we use in as an application to like manage the code changes or manage the file changes in our project files that are happening over time. And then we use GitHub more specifically to take those, like take the Git bundled up versions of our project and then save it somewhere outside of our computer. And that's what GitHub is for. But there's a number of different platforms that do similar work to GitHub. GitHub just so happens to be one of the more popular ones, and like learner friendly, beginner friendly, et cetera, et cetera. So it definitely is interesting because, sometimes people get mixed up on Git and GitHub and like, what is the difference? Git is the tool that we use to actually make the changes and save things and stuff. GitHub is like a platform where we can save, where we choose to save the stuff that we're using Git to save. And so, yeah, if you really get a deeper dive into GitHub, and we'll do some more, I'll talk a lot more about GitHub and like how to organize your GitHub and get it set up for like professional use. Like, how would you set up a GitHub account to, like, how should you set up your GitHub page in order to be ready for people to look at if you're like looking for a job, or if you were, just like sending out your profile links out to different people. But more what we're going to do today is kind of see how the tool of Git interacts with the tool of GitHub as we're building out a project, and like talk about some of the more like important kind of Git commands and steps that you would take as you're like changing things on a project, and like as those changes are happening, being able to record them and then save them for later use and whatnot. So we'll talk a lot more about GitHub specifically, and we're going to do that in the context of talking more about React, right? So the other day, we also started talking a lot about React. We walked through the documentation. So I'm on the reactjs.org website. We started just going through the docs because there's just a lot of great material inside of the docs on like how to get started with React. And but the majority of what we're going to be doing is literally just walking through the documentation as it kind of highlights like the main concepts of React that are important for you to know. So these 12 main concepts are the things that we're going to be walking through together. And so, last time, in our last kind of time together, we started talking first about getting started with React. So we walked through kind of the installation steps, and we talked about how there's different kinds of ways that you can use React. And so the important thing to understand with React is that there are a number of ways that you can add it into your websites as you're starting to work with it. So before we started working on like regular like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript websites, and then learned a lot about like the document object model and how JavaScript does a lot of things for us in the background of like a website, like a regular HTML, CSS website. And then we kind of started talking about React, and I walked through it to a degree, and we talked a little bit about what's going on. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on behind the scenes of those files that I mentioned before. And then we'll talk a lot about like how do you then start working with React. But if you haven't already, you're going to have to definitely kind of understand getting started with it. So if you are adding React to your own website, there's a specific way that you do that with regards to you can add some scripts that bring in React into your current website. That's one way to add React to an existing HTML, CSS website. But for the most part, if you have a website that you want to add React to, this is what you would do is like, you can add React as a script, and then you can, almost insert React into specific parts of your existing website. That's an approach that some people would take based on what the website is that they already created. If you're starting a new React project from scratch though, and like you're open to starting the new website from scratch or converting an old website into a formal React project, sometimes it's better, instead of using these script tags and adding React via these scripts like this page talks about, it's better to kind of go through creating a new React app period and using what we call a React tool chain to do so. The tool chains are basically just like libraries of code that give you certain things out of the box. Like they kind of pre-configure a project for you. They give you the kind of the main files and components that you would need to get started. They connect your project to Node via NPM, so you can add more libraries to it, and other things like linting or giving you a server so that you can see your code changes over time, and then being ready for like production level code as well. And so the tool chain that we're going to be working with is the Create React App toolchain. And last time we were together, I kind of mentioned how Create React App toolchain is like the easiest one for beginners to use. All you need to be able to work with the Create React App toolchain is to have Node installed on your machine. And with Node, like a Node version at least greater than 14, you'll be able to use the npx create react app command to then create a new application that is going to be pre-configured with all of the things that you need to run an actual React project. And so, yeah, as you know, folks learning React, I think that the Create React App toolchain is super helpful because it just is very simple to get started with, super simple to use, and gives you all of the files and features that you'll need out of the box to start a React app in a development environment. And of course, there's a couple other tool chains that we will talk about later on in like kind of our learning process. But Create React App is definitely one of the more popular and easier to get started with tool chains. Cool. So basically what we're going to do real quick is run through this tool chain, create another application, talk about what's going on in that process again, and get started like going into the application. By now, you probably have run the tool chain yourself, or if not, you can follow along and watch what happens when you run the tool chain. And after we go into the files structure, we're going to start making some changes. And then that's when we'll link it back to like working with Git and GitHub and like connecting the project and talking a lot about what Git does, what Git will allow us to do now that we have React project that we're working on, or some project that we're working on. Cool. So first thing I'm going to do is just kind of run through these commands. These commands are meant to be inserted into your command line or like your terminal based on whatever machine you're using. So open up whatever like terminal or command line you are familiar with. You can also use the command line in VS and Visual Studio Code if you want. Like for me, I kind of go between one or the other. Like if I use my regular terminal, you can see I already have it docked here in my Mac. I also sometimes will just use the VS Studio Code terminal as well. For the sake of this particular tutorial, I'll just use the regular terminal and kind of just start a new project that way. So what I'm going to do is just open a new window of my terminal, and that will pop that up right here. I'll zoom in a little bit so y'all can see as I'm typing. And essentially, I'm going to just run these commands, right? These commands that are listed here. But the thing I want to make sure that I do before I kind of start going crazy there is make sure I'm in the spot on my machine that I want to save the code. So in order to, when you run this npx create react app command, it's going to just pop up. It's going to run the command wherever it's already located. So you're going to want to make sure that you're running it in a file that you're comfortable with it saving files to. So right now on my Mac, you can see I'm on my root folder. If you open up your command prompt or you open up your terminal, it'll probably start you in your root folder or your C drive if you're on a Windows machine or something like that. So you want to just make sure that you navigate to the proper place where you want to save that code. So for me, for instance, if I want to save this to my desktop, I want to make sure I change into my desktop so that the path that I'm on now is pointing to my desktop, right? Or whatever folder. If I had another folder in there, you know, I could make sure that I change into that particular folder before I run the script. The cool thing about the Create React App toolchain, though, is that it creates a folder for you. So long as you're in the main folder where you want to save another project folder, you're good. So yeah, so let's say I'm on my desktop and I'm cool with it saving the project there. I'm gonna just run this command now. So I'm gonna say npx create -react -app, and let's say I'm gonna call this app components, and just press enter. My computer might take a minute because I got a couple apps up, both for class and streaming purposes. But you know, what happens here, I could talk through it one more time, is the Create React App toolchain has a set of scripts that start running instantly. It first tells you, and it logs out output that lets you know what's going on in the script at different moments. So the first thing it says is, hey, I'm creating a new React app in this path. So remember, this is why I was saying earlier, you want to be mindful of where you're saving the project, right? So clearly I'm saving this project to my desktop, but it's getting saved in a folder with the same name as the name I passed into this npx create react app command. After it starts creating the new folder, it starts installing packages into that folder. Particularly the packages it starts installing are React, React DOM, React scripts, and these are 3 packages that come from the Node package manager, which is npm. You can probably ascertain why we would need React or like React DOM, but essentially the React package has a set of library, set of files and that we can use out of the box with React to start writing our React code. The React DOM is a very important feature of React that we'll get into as we start making changes and see our app up on the live server. Essentially, what React does that makes React work super fast and in the style that it does with its own component structure and stuff is it creates this thing called a virtual DOM. You might remember the DOM, like just this word DOM, from earlier conversations about JavaScript that we were having, right? And we talked about how in JavaScript, we manipulate the DOM using JavaScript, right? And the DOM stands for the document object model. What React does is create this interface that sits between the regular DOM on our browser and kind of our React code base. And that interface in between the two is called the React DOM. What your React code does is it interacts with that React DOM interface that then, when necessary, updates the actual DOM of your website. So it's kind of like a layer in between your regular browser, so what you would see on your actual screen, and the code that you're writing in React. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then React scripts is a set of scripts that work with React to like launch the server, for instance, and trigger a build of the code when you're ready to build the code and stuff like that. So all super necessary. They're all super necessary packages for getting started working with the React stuff. Let me just lift my computer up a little bit. Cool. So awesome. So after it installed those packages, it does a couple things with like resolving those packages. Each package itself might have other packages that it relies on. So this is why the script takes some time sometimes, is it has to download a lot of different things. But every time you work with Node and you're installing new packages, it creates a couple other files for you. It creates what's called a lock file, which kind of is like like a snapshot of the packages that you've installed at this current moment in time. And it saves these new packages that you've looked to install as what are called dependencies, which is just like a fancy name for like, what kind of packages does this project rely on having in order to work, right? Like what is this project dependent on in order to do what it needs to do? And yeah, so it takes a couple dependencies, says that. It tells us that it initialized the Git repository, which is something important that we'll come back to right after, once we start talking about triggering, connecting this to GitHub, which we'll talk about in a couple seconds. But in essence, right, the Git repository, remember how I was saying Git is a tool that lets us kind of like consolidate all of these changes we're doing in our files and in our projects. We call any project that is using Git has to have what's called a Git repository initialized in it. You could think of the repository as like a space in which Git is going to track whatever files we want it to track that we're making changes to. Git is smart enough to tell us, hey, here's the files inside of this folder that have been changed. We can tell it, hey, like add those changes, add those changed files to what we would call a commit, which is kind of like a snapshot of that file structure at that moment in time. And then once we've added and committed those changes, we can then Git like saves those commits in a very simple way for us to like go back through over time. So it's almost like a history of your saves at different points. Somebody last time I think mentioned like it's like a video game, like saving stuff on a video game or something like that, which is true. It's like kind of like saving your code at these different increments and whatnot. The purpose of having a Git repository is just that, right? To save the code in these different commit snapshots. And then you can use Git as a tool in your command line to say, hey, I want to go back to version 1 of the code before I like made this other change. And you can use Git to do that on your local machine. Where Git and GitHub start getting tricky is that is all happening locally. But, you know, what if something happens to your computer, or what if like, you know, suddenly like those files got deleted somehow, right? Like now you're kind of SOL, right? So it would be helpful if you could save those changes elsewhere, right? And you could do that in a hardware sense. Somebody asked that question, like, well, couldn't I just save these on another external hard drive or something? And yes, you could, but that doesn't make it then easy to share with other people also, right? So what GitHub does is it creates a solution that allows for you to save your code elsewhere from your local machine, but also in the process of doing that, other people can collaborate on those files alongside you. So that's kind of the difference between Git, which is this tool for saving the code in your local environment, and GitHub, which is another tool that lets you take those Git repositories you're creating and then collaborate with other people on them, and also save them, save your changes to the cloud in more specific ways. So I'm sure the thing had finished downloading. Last couple things that happened here, just continue to add those dependencies, and then it made a Git commit for us. So remember what I was saying earlier, a Git commit is essentially like a snapshot of your code at a particular moment in time. We make multiple Git commits whenever you edit something, and like whenever you edit something, you would have to make a new Git commit to commit the changes that you've edited, that you made while editing. And so after Create React App finally, like it went through, created a bunch of files for us, and you know, did all the library installation and stuff. It had also created a new Git repository, and then it made our first commit for us. So remember, I said you add all the files you want to make a commit with. You can make the commit, and now you have that saved in your kind of Git, like the log of your history in Git, and like all the stuff you've ever done inside of Git. And that's kind of what Git is there for. It's just cool that Create React App has this those two steps already integrated into it, right? To make it easier for you to have a Git project already created on your machine. So then it tells you like, yeah, bet, yeah, success, we did it, yeah. we made a project for you. It tells you inside of this folder. If you go inside of this folder, there's also a bunch of commands you can run. And first steps it requires you to do is change into that directory. So use the CD command to change into it. And then you have some script that's there to start your project. Again, you might be seeing this say npm instead of yarn, and that's totally fine. I just use a different package manager called yarn, but npm and yarn are doing similar things in this case. And cool. So in order to start working with the project, we got to change into the directory that we just created and start up the project. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll just go into that new folder. And first thing I'm going to do before I like start it, I'm just going to run the list storage command. So ls, which basically prints out all of the things going on inside of my folder right now. So I have a couple new files inside of this components folder that was created. And we got a README, node modules, package.json, another folder called public, source folder, and some like lock file for our packages. So if you're using npm, you'll see like package-lock.json. If you're using yarn like me, you'll see like yarn.lock. And that's kind of like what the Create React App toolchain does for us, is set up a basic project structure like this for us. One thing I want to mention is that this is not all of the files that are actually here. There's a couple hidden directories, hidden files in your terminal and on your machine. One of the reasons why you would want to use your terminal sometimes versus just your GUI interface for navigating your files, right? So the difference between like my terminal and like using Finder on my Mac, or using kind of like the File Explorer and like a Windows computer or whatnot, is that on the terminal, I can see the hidden files that are not shown up by default, right? So if I run the ls command with the -a flag, the -a flag will allow me to see all of the files inside of this folder. including the hidden files. And hidden files typically start with a dot in front of them. So we got this .git folder, we have this .git ignore folder, or we got this .git folder, we have this .git ignore file. And these, I wanted to show you that we have this .git folder because when you create a a new Git repository, when you initialize a new Git repository, it creates this .git folder for you. That's what that command git init does. And so we'll see that in another sense in a second. The .git ignore file is a file that is specifically used for ignoring files that you don't care about. Like these are like files that like don't make sense, that like you don't want Git to ever track for you, right? So you can very specifically tell Git to like, hey, like there's a couple of files that I don't care about, right? And like some of those files I don't want Git to know about, right? And so things like, you know, these Create React app gives you a couple of files by default that it ignores for you. Basically, that means that none of these files will ever be saved to Git, saved to your Git history. And by extension, if it's never saved to your local Git history, it's never going to be saved onto GitHub as well. So if you're working with on a project and you're like, dang, this file has like API keys that I don't want people to know about. Like I don't want people to steal my login information to AWS, for instance. Oh, well, let me make sure I don't commit that to Git and GitHub so that people can see it. So you might add that file to your Git ignore file because you don't want it to be saved online. We'll see some more practical examples of this in a bit, but to know, what you should know is that Create React app by default ignores some of the larger files that you don't really need it to track for you, like the node modules, for instances. Node modules is a big folder that has like all of the dependencies that you tried to install and the dependencies that those dependencies needed to depend on. And so that folder just tends to take up mad space in any like JavaScript project. So it's best practice to not include it in your version control, because it'll just be a bigger file than it needs to be, right? And people can always install those dependencies over on their own. So we don't necessarily put it up for people to see on in our like GitHub history and stuff like that. But cool. So now that we have kind of this like these files already created, let's just do let's just do like what it says. So first we did the script Create React app, we changed it to the directory. Now we can just run the npm start command. So I'm just gonna go ahead and just run npm start and it should still work for me. Cool. And so yeah, the npm start command is just gonna run that React script start command that we were talking about before. Is like, so React scripts was a package we installed. The start is a script that's defined inside of one of our files in particular. And when you run that, it should pop up a new tab in your whatever browser you were just looking at, and basically give you the ability to see your React app hosted on a development server. Again, my drawing's taking a little bit of time just because I got a couple different apps running all at the same time. While it does that, I'm gonna grab some water. Gotta stay healthy and hydrated out here, you know what I'm saying? Cool. So this is the default Create React app application. It's just a simple app that has like a spinning image, some text, and then like a link to the React documentation. So whenever you see, whenever you start a new React app out, this is what you'll see. So you'll know you succeeded in getting your app to start if you see this whenever you run npm start. Again, in order to have this pop up and in order to have the ability to go and see this on your browser, you have to have the server up. In order to have the server up, you have to run that npm start command inside of the folder that you are in. by doing that, it's going to launch a server on localhost 3000 by default. Localhost is kind of a shorthand for your local network on your computer that your computer's connected to. So only your computer will ever know what localhost is for it. So if you had your server up and I went to localhost 3000 on my computer, I wouldn't see anything because I don't have a localhost server up. This is what we call a development server, because it's hosted on your local machine, right? And only you have access to it currently. So if you wanted to make it so that other people can see your application, that's when you would host your application on an actual server, like an external server, or a server configured to receive traffic from other people. You could do that on your computer, but it doesn't really make sense to do that. Because of you would have a lot of files that people would be getting access to that. I don't think you'd want that to be the case. But cool, so yeah, run an npm start will give you this local server running with your code, and that will be hosted at localhost on the port 3000. And this colon signifies the port that you're going to, the port of the machine that you're going to go on. And so different applications in the web context run on different ports of your machine or different ports of your this particular network that you're on. It just so happens that Create React app, when the server starts, that it chose to use port 3000. Sometimes if port 3000 is running, like another application's running, it'll give you the option to run it on a different port, like 3001. And yeah, so it's not like specific that it has to be on port 3000, but it is specific that whatever port it runs on is the port that you'll see your application running on as well. Groovy. So dope. So we got our React app kind of configured using Create React app. And normally the next best step, right? So say I'm starting a new project. I'm about to build the next thing, the next best SoundCloud. I'm about to build some dope app that, like, you know what I mean? Like everybody and their mama finna use, right? So typically the best next step to do is create a Git repository, like for your, create source, source control and like version control for your project, so that as you make changes, you can save your changes. And if something goes wrong, you can go backtrack and stuff like that. And so to do that, it kind of gets hard because you need to type commands. But as you can see, we're running a server, so you can't really type commands in here and it's not going to do anything, right? Because it's running a server. So this terminal is already kind of being utilized for something specific. So I can't necessarily run my Git commands in here or any commands in general in here. So typically you might have your application running on a server on one like terminal instance. And then you could do something simple like open another terminal window. So I just use on my Mac, basically like Command T. So like to open a new tab. On Windows, it'd probably be like Control T or something like that. Or you could just all in all, just go and open another window of your terminal, right? So by doing that, you can see I'm back inside of this folder for the project that I already created the Create React app on. The server is still running, right? But now I'm still in the project folder, so I can start typing in different commands in here that I want to work with and stuff. This is where I typically start to open my project in VS Code, because I'm gonna not only want to run commands, but I'm also gonna want to see some of the files too, right? So instead of just opening this second terminal like this, what I'm gonna do instead is open another VS Code window and then use VS Code to look at all my files and then use the terminal in VS Code, while this terminal is just dedicated to keeping the server up, and so I can see all my changes and stuff. So I'm gonna just show you this because I already have it configured to do this, and then I'll teach you how you can do it. But I'm gonna type in a command that says code and put dot, and this is gonna open this particular folder in VS Code for me. So you can see my VS Code is loading, and it's gonna open a new VS Code window with my with my specific project. So VS Code added this dope security feature to just make sure that you're cool to execute files in that particular folder. I can say, yeah, that's me. I trust the authors. And so now I got this dope VS Code window that has a view of all my files on the left-hand side. And then I can open a new VS Code terminal. And by opening this terminal, the cool thing about opening it from the command line like that is it automatically is set up to be inside of this file, inside of this folder. So that's just like a cool feature of VS Code, is the ability to run a command that opens whatever folder you're looking at in VS Code super easily. And if you want to set that up for yourself, it's pretty simple. You can just click go. Is it go or is it view? Go to view. And then open up what's called the command palette. And inside of the command palette, when you open it, you're going to see a couple different commands that VS Code can run. Yours might not say it at the top, so you're going to want to type install. And you should see some command come up that says install code command in path. This is and once you click this command is going to run a specific command on behalf of VS Code. That's going to install a new command that you can use in your terminal called code. And that will allow you to always use that command in the terminal whenever you want to open a folder or a file specifically from the command line. So dope little shortcut, dope little hack. Makes your life easier as a programmer to know some of these things. And so because I already had it installed, you see it says recently used. That's why I was able to run this command. Other text editors do this. I think you can do this on Atom as well. But I just, for the purpose of the course, I'm just showing you VS Code is one of my favorite text editors. And one of the reasons why is because I could do stuff like that really easily too. But cool. So that's not really the point. The point is you can open the folder that you created however you want. You could also open it by saying file and then open, you know what I mean? Like you could do it that way too. Or you could just drag the folder on top of the VS Code icon. And I think that opens it up the folder as well. So number of different ways, take your pick. I like to do it the programmatic way most times because I'm normally inside of the terminal. Like you see, I was already in here for this. It's nothing to go into a new directory and just like hit the code dot to open it in VS Code. Now I can get rid of this. Still have my server up, which is great. So my website's still up and running. But then now I also have the VS Code up as well so that I can quickly kind of go between the code and the website to see what's going on. So dope. Now that we have that up, we can actually start messing around with some of the command line tools that we need to do for this particular project. So first thing I wanted to show you was that Git actually created that commit that it was talking about. So one of the first commands you're going to want to learn is Git log. So Git is the name of the command, and right, in order to use Git, you have to have it installed on your computer. So again, if you don't have Git installed on your computer, this command won't work. It'll tell you, hey, unidentified command Git or something like that. In order to resolve that, you're just going to want to go to the Git sem.com website, which is the Git source code manager. That's what the SCM stands for. And the website will allow you to download whatever the latest version of Git is on your machine. By having that installed, that's when you can start using Git on the command line and using all those tools that we were talking about before. If you didn't have Git installed on your machine, chances are that the Create React app, when it tried to create the Git repository, it wasn't able to do it. And so it probably didn't create a Git repository for you. So before you do the Create React app stuff, make sure you have Git installed on your machine. Or, you're going to just have to do a lot of the stuff Create React app did for you manually, which actually isn't that hard. And I'll show you that in a second. But since we do have Git installed, right, we're able to run these Git. Now we are able to run any commands that use Git as a base. So the Git log command is like a really important command. This command will show you all of the commits that have been recorded on the local Git repository. So remember I showed you that little folder, the .git folder that was inside of the folder. And I was like, hey, like this big .git folder is representing the represents, like, right, if I do ls-a, this .git folder represents the local Git repository. So this is what we're talking about when we say that, okay, well, Git log, where is it pulling this information from? Well, inside of this .git folder is a whole lot of interesting kind of configurations that, and like just things to make Git work within this particular folder. I'm not gonna get into all of it. You could definitely look into some of what's going on here on the Git website and read about it and read about like some of the documentation. But all you need to know for right now is that these specific files and folders are meant to keep a track of what is the latest Git commit, right? Well, like what's the last Git commit that we have? What particular branch are we on? And the branch represents basically, a branch is essentially the code at a particular, like, so basically we can use this idea of branching in Git to isolate versions of our code in terms of our local repository. So it's a very helpful tool, but it's a little more complicated. So we'll talk about it a little later on. But all you need to know is that .git folder has a lot of pre-configured logic and scripts inside of it to keep track of all of the things you're doing with Git. So things like the log, which is a history of all of the commits you've made, is made possible through this .git repo that was in the Git repo that was initialized inside of the project for us. So I'm gonna just make sure I go back out of that. So I'm back in my components folder. I'll clear this, but like, so yeah, Git log will show you all of the commits that have been made. And so you can see that there's a commit and it has this like hash value that represents the like unique number of like that commit. So this is as you can tell, like a very long string of alphanumeric characters. Because this is unique, we can always reference this particular commit with that unique hash. And so that's how you would use Git to like, oh, if I want to go to an old commit, I can do that by referencing this old hash and pulling up to that particular Git commit. And it also shows you the author. If you have this configured, and we'll talk about that in a second, it'll show you the author of the Git commit. Clearly it's me. It'll show you the date and time that commit happened. And it'll show you the commit message, which is like a unique message that you get to type in whenever you make a commit. So this one was made for us by Create React App. It made a commit that said initialize project using Create React App. So that's our first Git command, is Git log. Another Git command that's really helpful to know that exists is called Git Status. And Git Status is really simple. It just prints a status message on like what's going on inside of the Git the Git repository in the working folder. So it'll tell you stuff like what branch are you on. By default, you'll start on a branch either called master or main. Typically it starts off called master. And then if you have changes, it'll tell you what files have changed. Right now, we haven't really changed anything. So it's saying nothing to commit, but we'll use this command Git Status a whole bunch of times. And we'll see this command, we'll see this output change as we continue working on the code. And yeah, so Git Status, Git log to see all the commits. As we make more commits, we'll use this Git log command and we'll see more commits. Git Status shows you kind of what's going on inside of the folder and like a status on like what branch are you on currently. So those are two important commands to know. And then of course, there's a couple other commands that we want to understand that we can use with Git. So I'm just gonna clear out this terminal so that it's easier to see. And I'm gonna use the command git. So actually, in second thought, we already have this code from that first commit that Create React App did. So let's actually talk about what Git is doing for us now and how we can extend it. So right now, Git is stored in this local folder, right? This components folder. That .git file folder we were just taking a look at has certain records of like what's gone on in our project so far. So far, right, if we did the Git log again, we have one commit, and that commit was made when create react that first ran. And then if we look at the Git status, we have nothing more to commit because everything is clean. We haven't made any updates yet to the commits that we have. And that's what Git is useful for, is like storing these different commits, which are like basically snapshots of our files at a specific moment in time, and letting us know, hey, did we change anything, or do we need to commit something else because we've changed something? And if so, Git lets us know that, and then we can make another commit. Otherwise, it tells us there's nothing to commit. You don't have to make any new commits. We have an updated commit with all of these current files. So that's what Git locally will do for you, is like allow for you to store these references to your files over time. But again, right, what happens in the case that like something goes wrong with our machine, or like we want to send this code to somebody else? It's not as straightforward to do just with this tool alone, right? Like, how would I go about like sending this snapshot, for instance, of this code to a friend of mine or something, right? Like I would have to download all these files, email them, or send them over like Google Drive or something, and like, but that doesn't really help that person also keep track of this history over time. So if I make more changes, how will they know like the changes that I made and why I made those changes? And that's where Git can be extended by way of using GitHub, which we started talking about earlier today, right? So by having this cloud-based system that allows us to push some of our Git repository code to like some external server or in database, now anyone, no matter where they are, can get a reference to that particular Git repository, and like by making like a request to it, and like make changes to it also in a shared space, in a collaborative way. That's literally what GitHub is useful for. And so now that we actually have, well, we have our server running. I didn't mean to click that, I meant to click this. Now we have like kind of a project that has like Git like started inside of it, and we have a commit and all of that. Now is when you're like, oh, cool, like I want to actually add this to GitHub. Let me do that, right? Because maybe I'm working on this project with some friends, or maybe I just expect myself, to want to make changes in a more public way, or like it's going to become an open source project, or maybe it's not even going to become an open source project. It's going to always be private, but I'm just worried that something might happen to my computer, or to my code on my local computer. Or I have two computers. Like some people have a desktop computer. Like what if you, for instance, some of y'all might be going to a place to take classes in person, and you have to use a different computer than when you would at home, right? So how could you make sure that the code you've been working on in one place could then be used in another place? Well, you can use Git to save all of the changes locally, but then you can use a tool like GitHub, or a tool like Bitbucket, or a tool like GitLab, right? Any external tool that allows you to save your repositories online, and then you can have access to them later from those different machines. And that's what makes Git and GitHub work together. So let's talk about how we would connect like our local, I keep doing this, keep going to that wrong part. Let's talk about how we would go to our, how we connect our local project. Like right now we have, because this project is on my computer, I call it my local project, right? It's local to me. Let's talk about how we would connect this local project to a remote project, or a cloud hosted project, right? So to do that, we need to create another separate repository on GitHub. So it's kind of confusing, right? We created a repository inside of our code base here locally, but now what we're going to do is create another repository online on the cloud that we can connect to our local repository, so that when we make changes locally, we can also save those changes here in the cloud using GitHub. And so to do that, we're going to just click this new repository button, and that new repository button is going to allow us to create a new repository on GitHub. So remember, this is remote. This is literally only on GitHub. So when you create a new repository on GitHub, it says, hey, a repository contains all project files, including the revision history. So remember, Git is storing this revision history. So as I already have a project repository, you can import it. There's a helpful tool to import a repository, but we're engineers, we're programmers. We don't use dashboards, we use the terminal. So we're gonna use a terminal to do this. The only thing you need to know at this point, or the only thing you need to do, I should say, at this point is create a repository name for your particular repository that you're connecting to your local repository. So to do that, I'm gonna just create a repository called components, just because it's normally best practice to name your repository whatever you named your project folder, so long as the naming is consistent. And that's really all I need to do now, because technically the description is optional. This is just a little tagline of what this project is about. I like to put description, so I might just, like, for the sake of testing this, to say sample project to teach students more about connecting Git to GitHub, right? Public and private. Repos start public as default. This allows for people to take a look at them online. There's no shame on having like unfinished projects or anything on public, but if you're like a business and you have like code that you don't want people to look at or stuff like that, you might put it private. Normally I keep most of my repos public, unless I'm doing like a work project, which I keep private. So, you know, take your pick. But for now, we can leave this public. You can see it says here, like, you can also initialize your GitHub repo with a couple files if you want, like a README or a .gitignore file, or even a license file. But we already have this created for us with Create React App, so we can actually skip this step. And it says to skip this step if we're importing something existing. There's a good reason for this, why we will want to skip this step, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm gonna just create the repository, and what you see is gonna happen is it's gonna like tell me, hey, give me some options for how I can like work with the GitHub to like connect my local repository, which is the one here that is already has one commit, right? And this commit said initialize project using Create React App. So here, GitHub is cool because it shows you some of the like setup steps that you need to do in order to like get things working. Now, in order to work with GitHub, this is a kind of a little pivot that I have to tell y'all, because of the fact that you might be running into this issue already, and it's just something to know. There's two ways to make a connection to a GitHub hosted repository, right? So now we're only talking about the GitHub hosted repository here. The two ways you can make a connection to it is via HTTPS or SSH. The savvy networking inclined people might already know what the difference between HTTPS and SSH are. HTTPS is like a secure version of the hypertext transfer protocol, which we talked about a while ago when we first talked about like web dev and like how we make requests to other servers, and we can use HTTP to make requests over the web, et cetera, et cetera. HTTPS is just the secure protocol for hypertext transfer. SSH is the secure shell. It's another way of connecting to another machine. And SSH basically logs you into a specific machine at a specific port and whatnot. And so you have these two options for how you can connect your repositories, or connect your GitHub, your remote GitHub to your local GitHub. And you might be running into an issue already if for like security purposes, where like you're trying to run some of these new Git commands, right? Like to either create a new repository or push a new repository, right? Mostly it'll happen when you start trying to push, and you'll get this error that's saying something like, hey, you know, you need to add some token to your terminal for this to work, or stuff like that. And that kind of goes into like some of the security stuff that you need to do to set up Git fully on your machine. So I'm just gonna run through these commands just to show you, just to finish up this example. Then I'm gonna show you more about that whole connecting the dots between Git and GitHub stuff. And so essentially what you want to do is there's two scenarios. There's scenario one, you haven't started the project at all. You might have a folder, but you don't have any code ready to go yet, right? And in that case, you might want to create a new repository on the command line. What gets confusing here is this is creating a new local repository. So we didn't see Git init yet, but this is a Git function that creates a new repository in a folder. So just to show y'all what I'm talking about, if I go to another folder, so I'm gonna get out this components folder. I'm on my desktop, right? I'm on my desktop, but I'm just gonna make a new folder called create new, and then change into that folder, right? So this is just an empty folder. As you can see, when I list it, there's nothing inside of there. So this first set of commands is for a situation like this, where you have just an empty folder, there's nothing inside of it yet, and they're just trying to give you some helpful steps to like commit for your first time to GitHub. But I kind of find this set of steps confusing for folks who are getting started, because it's like, yo, like I know I want to create a new repository, but some of the stuff it's doing is already you already have some of these files if you're using something like React, or you might already have files from like a project you're working on. What if you're working on a Python project and now it's time to add it to GitHub, right? Some of this stuff doesn't really make sense. If you already have code installed, you can you're gonna want to push the existing repository, but chances are, if you're not using a tool like Create React App, you don't have that repository created, like a local repository. So that's what the git init command is gonna do for you. So let's just walk through this example of like creating a new repository in the case that we have a blank repository here. So like here I have this blank folder, right? I'm just gonna run through these commands and we'll see one by one what each of these commands is doing. So I'm gonna do first echo, says echo, and then in quotes, it says components, and it puts that output into a folder, into a file called readme.md. Remember, I just did an ls and there was nothing that came up. So now I'm gonna run this echo command. And in running that, right, in the terminal, whenever you see a new line like this, it typically means the command before worked successfully. So now if I ls, now my empty folder has a new file called readme.md. Well, what did this command do then? Well, this command echo prints something, and then it put the print that it printed into this new file for us. So if I were to look at that readme, you can see I have this thing printed inside of it. So basically, this first line created a file for us called readme.md with some string inside of it. Okay, well, I didn't have any files before, so that's cool. Now the git init, if I run git init creates a new empty Git repository in the folder that you were creating it in. So this is the first step you normally use to create a local repository, is git init. So if you were like working on, if you were like finishing a project and like you're like, oh, I want to put it on GitHub, I want to put it on GitHub now. Well, in order to put anything on GitHub, you need to already have a local repository. Create React App, when we did the Create React App steps before we launched our server, Create React App did that for us. But if you were working on a project that wasn't Create React App and you were just using Git in general, you're gonna have to initialize this project for yourself. Like you're gonna have to initialize the repo for yourself. And once you do that, it tells you a couple things. It says using master as the name for the initial branch. The default branch is subject to change. To configure the initial branch name to use in all repositories, blah, 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 blah. It tells you can set some global configuration variables for your Git on your local machine, and it'll tell you like, cool, like we can do that kind of stuff for you. It also says if you want to change the name of the main branch that was created, the default initial branch, you just run this command git branch -m with the name of the new branch. most importantly, it created this new Git repository for us. So if I did the ls-a, you can see that now I have this .git folder that I was talking about before, which is the local this is the folder that tracks all of the local Git stuff. So now that this is in there, I can run Git status and I can see, oh wow, like some stuff happened that that says I need to commit. It says I'm on branch master and there's no commits yet. I have these untracked files. Well, these are basically files that were changed that now need to get added to the Git history, that it's not added to the history or it just got modified. So it says, hey, nothing added to the commit yet, but there's some untracked files. You should use git add to track them. And that's exactly what this next line is doing. Git add is a function on Git to add specific files that you want to track in the history. So it's important to use git add to add either individual files like this. So this is basically, this command is essentially saying, hey, add that README file to my tracked history, my tracked files for Git. So these would be the files that I care for Git to hold a reference to over time. So by running this command git add, right, it tells us here, use git add with the file name to include what we want to be committed. So I would say, okay, cool, like git add the README. Now, if I run git status again, you can see same thing, it tells me what branch I'm on. It says I haven't committed anything yet, but it says now there's some files ready to be committed. It turned the file green. So using git status, you can make sure that the files you want to have added for your commits are the right ones. So clearly this README was new. So Git has no clue about it at first. So now I'm saying git add, right? And git add says, okay, cool. Now we're gonna take a look and track this README file for you. The next step is to make a commit. So remember, locally on our machine, Git now, we can take files that we're making changes to and then commit them to our local repository. That's what this command is doing. It says git commit is the command to make a new commit. -m after this command is basically letting you pass in a message. So the git commit -m is like the typical syntax you'll see. And then you pass inside of the quotation marks the name of the particular commit, or the message you want to pass in the commit. To go back a sec to our create React app, right? When we did git log, we saw that we had this commit with this unique hash and this message down here. The -m refers to this message that you would see here. So it's important to normally put a pretty descriptive but short message that describes what's going on in this particular commit. The reason why is because now these commits are going to be snapshots to the different moments in time in your code base that you're going to want to get a reference to at different points in time. So if you just say first commit, first commit, first commit each time, if something goes wrong in your project, you're going to have no clue which first commit. Maybe you could use the time, but you know what I'm saying? It's harder for you to say, oh, I want to go back to that particular commit. And so we normally use these messages to be helpful descriptions of what's going on in the code. It's also very important in a professional context that you write descriptive commit messages, because that's how other people will use your code to work off of, right? In open source, or if you're working at a company, they would expect your commits messages to be coherent and easy to understand. So that's why it's important to pass a really good message there. So let's just run this command, git commit -m first commit. Right? And so now you can see something else popped out as output. It says root commit 4F4D4A0, which is probably part of that unique hash that we're going to see. It says first commit was the name of the message. And then it says one file change, one insertion, right? We added a new file that wasn't there before, and that file got changed. So that's what Git is going to do for you. It's going to keep track of the files changed and what changed. Was there insertions, was there deletions, stuff like that. So now that we have this, now that we've made this first commit, before we do these rest of these commands, I want to just show you, because we have now all the same stuff that was happening inside of our React app by default, because of create React app, are now just happening by our force, because we're running these first level these first level Git commands to initialize a repo and add specific files. So if I were to now do git log, right? Now you can see I have this commit. Remember earlier it said like 4F4 D4A0, right? That's the first couple of lines of this hash. So it was referencing this unique hash. Same thing, gives me the author, gives me the date, and it gives me the message of the commit, like first commit, right? So this is exactly what Create React App did for us. It initialized a repo for us while it was building out, while the scripts was running. It added all of the new files it created for us, and then it created a commit for us to use, where now we have this commit to work with. It's these next 3 steps that are important for connecting your local repository to a remote repository. And I wish one of these days, I'm gonna find somebody that work at GitHub, and I'm gonna explain my grievance. I'm gonna be like, yo, y'all gotta change this, man. This is not helpful for first-time coders and learners. Like, this is confusing. But I'm breaking it down so that y'all don't get confused. These first commands up to here are about, well, this first command in this example, this is an example. They're trying to give you an example of how to create a new thing on the command line. And they started by, hey, well, basically this should say, hey, you should set up whatever project files you want to have stored in a repo. In this case, they just create a README, which is cool, but there's no explanation that's helpful. But either way, these first steps are all about, first step, you create whatever files you need to create, right? So if it's a README file, it's a README file. If it's a Python app, it's a Python app. If it's a Java app, it's a Java app there. You're building your file structure. You're making your files inside of your folder that you want to use and put up into source control. Git init, git add, and git commit are the first 3 commands that you need to use whenever you're creating a local repository from scratch. You're creating it from scratch. Create React App did these 3 commands for us while the script was running. It initialized, that's when it said, initializing a new Git repository. It added all of our files. We didn't see any output that said this, but it added all of our files after it was done creating them for us. Then it committed them at the end. And that's why we were able to see this whole initialized project using Create React App as our first commit message. That's what the message they passed into here was. Now, the next 3 commands are the commands that are referring to how you will allow for your local code. So whether it's this local random folder that I'm talking about, or specifically like a React project that you're working on, how you're going to connect it to GitHub. And as you can see, these 3 commands that are highlighted on the top are the same 3 commands that are here at the push existing repository from command line. So you can see why I'm frustrated, right? It's like, you know what I mean? Like, if you were to just run these commands before, you might not understand, like, oh, well, where do I run these commands? Like, what files do I need to have before I can run those commands, right? And it doesn't tell you that you need to do these steps too. Like if you, after you create your own files and stuff like that. So I have a little bit of a grievance just with some of the wording. I wish they would just make one other section or something. But at the end of the day, if you're using Create React App, because Create React App creates a repository for you, you can go ahead and just add the origin and stuff like that. And so I'm gonna just run through these commands for the sake of time. I'm just gonna run through these commands on our React app and talk more about the other, like kind of like if you were doing this in a personal project that's not React, like how you would do these steps in that project too. So the first command that is important to know for like connecting your local repository to a remote repository is you need to let the local repository know what is the GitHub like address, like what is the web address of the GitHub, like how am I going to connect? Like you got to give me the unique URL or the unique kind of information of this particular remote repository that you're creating. And that's what this line is doing. It's taking this particular unique URL to this components, to this path for this components.git file, which is stored on GitHub. And it's letting me add that as a new, what's called origin. Whoops, not the terminal, back here. So I'm just gonna run this command, git remote add origin git at github.com. And this command basically connects our local repository to this remote GitHub repository that we created through a series of scripts. And we can test if you want to know, hey, what if you maybe you downloaded a project, you want to know what remote is this project connected to? Like if you want to see like, hey, is this project connected to anything on GitHub or anything on another servicing platform? If you want to check that out, you can run the command git remote -v, which basically lists out all of the remote connections that the local repository now has. So when we ran this command git remote add origin, it added a new remote that we called origin. So add takes the name of whatever you want to call that that connection to the external kind of service, right? So we're adding a connection to an external service called origin. And this particular external service is pointed at this unique URL. And it gives us two abilities. One is to fetch, which lets us pull changes. And then the other is to push, which lets us push changes. So now that we have this remote added, we can start both pulling changes. So if there was ever changes on the GitHub we want to pull, we can pull them, but then also we can push changes to the GitHub. So second, this intermediate step I don't even know why they decided to start doing this, but I think I know why, but I think it's just kind of funny that they tried to start doing this now. But the next step they tell you is, hey, let's just change the name of our master branch to main. And remember, like when we first initialized, I think it'll show it here. When we first initialized the Git repo, it says the master is the name for the initial branch, right? And then every time you use Git status, you see on branch master, on branch master, on branch master. Even here in the Create React app, it starts us off on branch master. Well, I think GitHub started to feel bad about slavery a while ago, and they were like, we should probably not call things master anymore. And they should have made that change mad long ago, but they did make that change, and it's not consistent across all of the platforms. So this step is really specific to GitHub. Just for the sake of following the commands, I'm gonna do it. But also, I think it makes sense to not use vocabulary. There's a lot of vocabulary in the tech space that's linked to like really weird things, like these narratives of like masters and slaves and all this other stuff, right? And why? You know what I'm saying? Like why?
I was taking a class last semester. I forgot, but it was like it literally said master like in reference to slavery, and I was just so uncomfortable. I was like,
yeah.
I forgot what class. It was like a function that kept doing things, or
right.
that had a lot of other things doing things, and I was just like, I hate it here. So
facts. Yeah, it's like really OD. But thanks for sharing, G. Like, yeah, it's a very common thing in like science and especially like in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering and stuff like that. It comes up a lot. But long story short, GitHub wants us to change the name of our main branch to main instead of master. We will oblige. You know what I'm saying? We will oblige. So by running this command inside of the whatever project folder you're in, it's gonna change your default branch so that when you go to Git status, it changes the name of that branch to be main. That's all that command does. Git branch -m. Remember, we saw that output in the first terminal that said that. Like if you do git branch -m with a new name, it'll change the new name. And so now we have this new branch called main, and it still says nothing to commit, working tree clean. We haven't really changed much here in this local project. We have the commit already there. We added the remote now. So now it's like, okay, what do you want to do next? And so now we just want to push the changes that we made, right? Which is the push, basically pushes the latest commit to the remote repository. So our local repository has a number of commits. We already saw we have one in there. Git push will push that change, but I don't want to say push that change, push that commit to our remote, whatever the remote called origin is pointing to. So this remote origin is pointing to this particular GitHub repo that I created, right? This is clearly github.com. Community is my GitHub username. /components was the GitHub project repo I created. And so this is very specifically pointing to this repo that we're currently looking at. So now that means that whenever I use this word origin, that's what I'm referring to, is this repo on my, I'm remotely hosted. When I push says take those commits stored locally and push them up. The -U stands for upstream. So it's just like kind of like a flag that says push it up to this particular remote host, which is origin. And it says, what branch do you want to push? And so because I'm on the main branch currently, you can be on different branches at different times. We'll talk about that another time. But because I'm on the main branch right now, I'm going to want to push the main branch, right? Because that's where the current code changes are at, right? And so by running this push, git push-u origin main, this is what will finally do the step of writing the changes, right? And taking all the objects that it needs to take, which are the files that it's keeping track of, and the files that it's keeping track of, and pushing them up to our remote repository, writing them to our remote repository. Here you see that name there. And then because there's no branches here, there's no commits here, it has to add some of those things to the main branch, to the remote repo. So that's where you see it says, hey, we created another branch called main to track what's stored on the remote repository called main. So kind of gets a little confusing because you see main from origin, and you see main from remote and main from local. But remember, remote is always referring to the GitHub hosted stuff. And then local stuff is hosted on our local stuff. So we have a local main branch, which is the branch we're working on right now. But now, as we refresh this page, we see all of our React code is now hosted here. And there's a new branch called main that's hosted here as well. This branch is our branch main on our remote repository, right? It's different than, it can become different than this branch main that is stored in our local project. And that's where Git and GitHub get a little confusing, because you have the branches named the same thing. But that's why as you start making changes to your local main branch, you're going to want to add commit, and push them to your remote main branch, so that anyone else that's looking at the remote main branch has access to your most updated code. So it's confusing, but it's confusing in the way that allows it to work how we would expect it to, which is so that if other people are using the using your GitHub repo, they can connect to the same part of the code that you're talking about or you changing and stuff like that. And so now that was like a really in-depth walkthrough of like Git getting connected to GitHub, right? Let's just show real quick, right? If you start making changes to this project, right? And you want to like, now we have we have all of the code that like is created by default for us in Create React App. And we already kind of walked through these files in another video. So I'm not going to do that right now. But if you recall, the app.js is like our main component in, it's like our first component in React that gets created. And so when we use Create React App, the app component is the first component that gets returned on the web, right? Like we still have this app up running. This is coming from the app component. And I can see that by going into the terminal, opening the source folder, going into the app.js, and inside of the app.js, we can see all of the code related to kind of what we're seeing here. And just as a reminder, this, even though it looks like HTML, looks like something that you might be familiar with, this is JavaScript. This is a syntax called JSX. JSX, my computer's still rendering some stuff, but JSX is a particular JavaScript syntax for working with React to define components, what we call React components and React elements. So each component is a function that has that returns specific elements that are like, you can use the HTML elements you're used to, but those HTML elements are turned into JSX, which you can use using this syntax here. So the shorthand is this stuff isn't HTML, but all of the elements that you're used to using in HTML, you can use in React, but it's just turned into what's called JSX. So don't get caught up saying that this is HTML, but remember that whatever HTML you're used to working with, right? So this is an image, this is the image element. You can see it says JSX attribute, like this is a JSX element, intrinsic element called image. So all of these elements are JSX, and the JSX is what interacts with the React DOM. So remember earlier I was telling you there's like this really interesting interface that React creates between our main DOM that's on our browser showing up right now like this, and it creates a layer in between this actual presentation and the code that's happening inside of the JavaScript. And so we'll talk more about the React DOM later, but let's say I wanted to make some changes to this application. And for the sake of kind of getting prepped for like our next class, let's say I want to add a new component into this app component to just render. So how might I do that, right? Well, I'm gonna have to create a new file, and inside of that new file, I'm gonna have to create some JSX that's going to relate to what that component is expected to show. And then I can bring that component into another component. So this is something we'll talk about. I'll talk about in another video, and I'm gonna share it out with y'all a little later on. But I'm just gonna do it for the sake of changing some stuff right now to finish up this conversation about GitHub. So I'm gonna do a couple things. I'm gonna actually make a new folder inside of this file structure. So if we looked at our file structure on GitHub, right, it's the typical React file structure. We have a source folder, and inside of the source folder, we have a couple files that literally is mirroring everything that we see here in VS Code. So I'm gonna do something interesting. I'm inside of the source folder. I'm like right clicking to pop up this menu. I'm just gonna say new folder. I'm gonna create a new folder called components. And inside of this folder, I'm gonna create a new file called, let's just say hello.js. And so I'm just gonna create a new component called hello that is going to, I'm gonna put up onto this new React app to like just change up a little bit of what's going on here. So in order to do that, we can learn a lot from this app component of how components are structured. There's two ways to structure components, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the future. We can create what are called class-based components or functional components. So for the sake of just like making it easy for myself and for y'all time-wise without talking too much about what's going on, I'm actually just gonna make another functional component just quickly just make a new component that we can use for the sake of right now. So in order to do that, I just copied it over. I don't need I don't need a logo. I don't need the CSS. I can actually clear out all of the JSX that's in here. So I just have this kind of like default function template. Instead of calling this app, I'm going to call it hello, so that this component has its own unique name. And every component needs to return some JSX. So inside of this component, what I'm going to do is return like a small div element that just says, yo, we hacking on React, right? So this is a very simple component. All it has is a div with some text inside of it. Very simple. But we'll talk more about the syntax of functions and functional components and class-based components starting in our next video. So now I saved this, and I talking about like kind of how components get connected. We have an export line that just basically says, hey, this file in this function called hello is going to be exported with the name hello, which is cool because now I can import that component into my current project by saying import hello from, and I pass the path of into that particular file. So it would be /components/hello. So now instead of this, instead of having kind of this image and like paragraph and link or whatever, I'm just gonna delete that part. Matter of fact, I'll just delete all the stuff that's going on in there. And then I'm gonna just open up my new component, hello. And so now I have my hello component. Because I'm not using this logo anymore, it's telling me it's not being used. So I'm just gonna clean that up, save this. And now if you just look at this app file is like 12 lines. And then when we saved it, the live server reacted within the React and just kind of put this new component up there on the virtual DOM for us, on the website, on the web app for us. This is actually on the DOM now, but it used the virtual DOM to make those changes for us in real time like this. That's the point though that I'm going to show you though, is now if we take a look at this app.js on GitHub, right? This is a 25 line app.js, but now we have this other app.js that's only 12 lines. Clearly it's completely different, right? So if I open back up this terminal, which is exactly what you're going to be doing, making changes all the time, right? So I'll just open the terminal back up. And I do like Git status now, right? We're gonna expect to see some changes. Well, clearly we're seeing a bunch of changes. It's saying, hey, the branch is up to date, but you have some changes that aren't staged for a commit. So now we have to add the files that we've changed. And we've added a couple different files. We have like this new app.js, we changed the app.js file, and we also have a whole folder of components that aren't even tracked at all, right? So clearly the app.js was already part of our GitHub push before. So it doesn't need to be tracked. It's used to it. It was already being tracked, but now it's modified. So Git is telling us, hey, you modified this file. Also, it's saying, hey, now you added some files that I hadn't seen before. You have to add those files if you want me to track them. So technically we could just do git add, and then, I could say git add like source / app.js and add this file very specifically, or git add source / components to add that folder very specifically. But after you've started making, after you made your first initial commit with all of your files, you normally are going to want to add all of the files inside of your folder at once. And there's two ways to do that using Git. The first way is to just add all of the files, and you can do that with git add space dot. Which is just a shortcut to saying add all of the files inside of this folder right now. And the other one is git add star, which will add all of the modified files. It will change only it will add only the modified files for changing. So if I do git add star real quick, right? And you can see it says, hey, the following paths are ignored by one of your git ignore files, which, remember I was telling you the .git ignore file is used to ignore certain files you don't want to add to Git. So it's saying, hey, your node modules folder isn't going to be added. Is that cool? And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But if I do git status, now it's tracking the modified app.js as well as this new file from the source components hello.js. Sometimes the add star works for new files. Sometimes it doesn't. So I always like to do a git status to just make sure all of the files I expect are added here correctly. If it wasn't added correctly with just the git add star, I would do a git add dot, and it's just gonna run through the same thing and add all of the files that it can add. But clearly, there's not a lot of new files that needed to be added, so it's going to show similar things. So git add star I typically start with git add star because it will add the bare minimum files, but git add dot is good for adding all of the files that you want to add to your commit. So the steps you got to remember is add, commit, push. So now that we added this, we want to commit it to be part of our local GitHub repository history, right? That's what the commit does. It says locally, I want to remember that I made this change, take a snapshot. And then now that I've stored it locally, I can push it to my remote place. So that's exactly what we did. We just did the add. So now we're going to do the git commit. So I'm just going to widen this a little bit so you can see, close this. So to make the commit, I have to, let me just, well, you just do git commit -m and you pass the message. So now I'm gonna say added hello component to app as my commit message, right? Helpful commit message so people can know what's going on. Clearly I added a new file. And if they were to look at the history, they'd see the changes that I made, right? So I can say commit to make that change. And then now that I've committed it, I could do a git log again and see now I have multiple commits stored in my Git history. I have the initial commit that was made by Create React app. And I also have this new commit that I just made that added my hello component to the app. And so that's what happens when you start making mad commits locally. You can start checking a look at them with git log. And in another video, we'll probably talk about like, oh, like reverting. If I made an error and I want to go back to this commit, for instance, how would I do that? We'll talk about more of those advanced kind of Git functions later. But I just wanted you to see that we have this new commit stored locally. And so that was the second step. You add, then you commit. Then the last step is to push. And so that is the step of saying, locally, I made a new commit. My commit's ready to be pushed to the remote. And I want to change what's hosted here on my remote repository. So here you see I only have one commit on GitHub. But now I wanted this to see that I have the second commit. So I'm going to do git push -u to say pushing it up to origin. Remember, origin is pointing to this GitHub repository that we created. And we named the main file, we named the new branch that it's pointing to main, right? That's the only branch we have up here. So I'm going to say push to origin main. So it's going to take this last commit that I just made, right? It's going to write it as a new commit onto GitHub. So when I refresh now on GitHub, you'll see that I have two commits, right? And also with the two commits, the second commit, one of the cool things about GitHub is it lets you see the changes made per commit. So if you go, let me just go back to the main components folder. If I click this commits, I can see all the two commits that were added to GitHub. And then if I were to, for instance, look at the added hello component to app, Git is going to present me the difference, like the diff, what we call a diff, like between my old GitHub repo and like the new one now that this commit got added. So clearly I changed my source.app.js file. Remember, I changed that on that last go round. So I got rid of some stuff. The stuff in red is always stuff you got rid of. I added some stuff. That's the stuff in green. Stuff that stayed the same is here in white. So Git is showing you the difference between the files as you were making the changes. It also shows that I added this file completely. And yeah, with GitHub, then, you know, if I was working with a group, somebody might make a comment on this and be like, cool, great commit, or like, thanks, super helpful, great. Like, and that's where GitHub starts getting social. You know, I'll talk a lot more about that later as well. But now that we've made this change, we now know how will we make changes to our local project, right? And like, how will we use those changes and like make sure we're keeping track of them locally in like our local repository, and then also make those same changes on our remote repository stored on GitHub. Because, you know, if ever something goes wrong with the project, like say for instance, like, who knows, something happens and like my whole repository is deleted, right? Like say like I just up and delete this whole folder, and like, you know, some things happen like that. Maybe I got on a different computer. I'm gonna go to a new, let's just say I go to another folder, right? So like inside of this folder, I don't have any reference to that old folder. Well, you know, what's cool about GitHub is now I can also just grab a reference to the GitHub folder, to the GitHub file, this GitHub repository. And I can use one last command that I'm gonna tell you before we break to make sure that to get a reference to the repository hosted on GitHub. And that's Git Clone. Git Clone is a command that lets you take the unique URL for GitHub for a specific repository and it lets you clone that repository hosted on GitHub on your local machine. So this is what you would do if you were like working on someone else's project and they started a repo and pushed it to GitHub, right? Now they have this repo up there and you're like, oh, I want to work on it with you. So what am I going to do? Grab a reference to this unique repo, go back to the terminal, and then run the command git clone with that particular repo. And what it's going to do is it's going to clone into that particular file, go through all of the different objects and make sure now I have on inside this folder a new folder that matches this complete repo. So if I go into this components folder, you can see I have all the files that I have that I created and pushed to GitHub already. If I go into the source file, right, and I look into the source file, clearly there's this folder called components. So it has our last change that we made just now. And that's how GitHub works at a high level when you're working on React projects, both when you're starting it, and then this is more like somebody started it and I'm trying to work on it, or hey, I lost my code and I need to get it back, how I would pull it down from GitHub. The cool thing about using the clone is that you can also do the logs and stuff, and all of your commits are still saved here in the logs, which is super dope, because now you can also still go back to these old versions that you posted, which is literally the purpose of Git at a high level. And so, yeah, y'all, we just talked about a lot of stuff. Hopefully you was rocking with me through the whole thing. But in essence, all we did was create a new React app. We made some new changes to one just to show like how we would connect it to Git and GitHub. And then we created a repository to host that repo and made some changes. And yeah, we also kind of tapped into a new kind of part of the class, which is creating our own a new component. I didn't really go too deep into it. And I might not go too more deep on functional components. I'll probably start off talking to y'all about class-based components. But either way, we created another component and added it to our app.js as like our first foray into building apps with React using different components and stuff. So hope this was cool. Hope this was helpful. I'm definitely going to stick around and answer any questions that folks have. But if you got to go, appreciate you for rocking with me, and I'll talk to y'all later.
Thank you, Professor.
No problem.
Goodbye, Professor.
Thank you. Take care, yo. Anybody have a question?
Yes, Professor, I have a question.
Yep.
For the Git, can't you just do the Git clone and then build a React app inside there?
Yeah, so that would be an example. You're saying like, can't I like make a new repo from GitHub and then like just clone that empty repo and then start making my files? Yeah, that's another way to set up your project. That would be that's a really intelligent way to do it, because now you have all the stuff set up and you don't have to worry about connecting those little things as tediously as we had to do just now. But not everybody would know to think about, oh, like, let me just make the repo first on GitHub, clone it using clone, and then work in that folder. But no, that's a really dope way, and probably like a even more efficient way to work with it. I thank you for blessing me with that dope way of working with it.
Okay, I was just making sure that I was doing things right.
No, yeah. Hey, man, anything that saves time and works, hey, that works well for all engineers. So that's cool.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Yep, no problem. Yep, take care. Any other questions? Go ahead.
I'm asking just to because it'll help me understand, not because I want to, but can I use, in theory, Git add dot all the time?
Yeah, in theory, yes. The thing that happens when you use add dot is more specific to what files get updated in this like history of the updates. So if you look at the kind of how the history of the messages here, a lot of these messages says initialize project using create React app, initialize project using create React app, and then this one says added hello component to app. So clearly this this source folder was updated when we made that last commit. And that is like a byproduct of one, we made changes to to some of these files, right? But sometimes when you use add dot, it will add all of these files, and then all of these files are going to be updated with a message that might not actually pertain to what files were actually changed. You know what I'm saying? Like all of the files will be referencing the same kind of change that took place, even if it wasn't specifically that file that was actually changed. And so sometimes I've seen that happen where these messages get changed. So like you would see a file like index.js, and we didn't really change index.js. So it's good that this says, hey, the last change for this is this particular change. If we use add dot, sometimes it'll change up all of those messages because it's adding all of the files. But add star will only add the specific files that are related to the change. So clearly those files will be marked with that particular commit. And that's why it's helpful to use, because then you keep your repository organized with like, hey, I only changed these files at this particular moment in time. And so other people can see when the last time a specific file was changed, or what like particular commit changed that particular thing, and then easily go to that commit and see it. So that's one of the reasons why I like add star is helpful. But you could, in theory, just use add dot. It wouldn't make too much of a difference, especially if you're working by yourself. It doesn't really make too much of a difference.
Thank you, Professor.
Yep, no problem. Good question. Any other questions?
Question about relating to the homework.
Oh, okay, word. Let me save that. For yeah, let's save that. Any other questions about this stuff?
Oh no.
No, I got
this.
you. I'm gonna wait my 7 seconds though, because it's like the teacher in me has to wait 7 seconds. And if no more questions